Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Almost Dropouts podcast. I'm your host, Daivik, and today I have Benjamin Kranc with me. Benjamin Kranc is a principal of Kranc Associates, a Canadian corporate immigration law firm based in Toronto. He also holds a BA in computer science from York University and an LLB from the University of Western Ontario. He was called to the Bar of Ontario in 1988 and certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario in 1997. He practices all facets of Canadian immigration law with an emphasis on corporate and business immigration issues. And yeah, I was really excited to have Benjamin on the podcast today to focus on getting work permits for people, in this case, in behalf of their employers, and to also get some insights into the immigration trends in the Canadian tech scene. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast,
Thank
Ben.
you for having me.
Yeah. So I guess starting off, let's talk about some of the major trends that you've noticed in the Canadian tech scene. So, what type of workers companies have been sponsoring? Have you noticed an increase in interest in the Canadian tech scene internationally? What are your thoughts right now in the Canadian tech scene and from the immigration purposes?
Yes, there's no doubt that the Canadian tech scene, in terms of the issue of recruiting foreign workers, is something that is booming at the moment. This is by design. The Canadian government recognizes that this is a field that benefits Canada, and that there's room and opportunity for Canada actually to benefit from this, but that in turn benefits the potential foreign worker employees as well. So certainly, the way the system works, there's sort of it's a funnel in the sense that there's a broad concept in general that it's actually designed to protect Canadian workers. By the way, of course, there are all kinds of issues in Canadian immigration law about security and family members and all kinds of other things. But we're focusing today, of course, just on the work permit issues. So in that regard, again, the philosophy of the Canadian government is that we want to protect Canadian jobs, and then we sort of work backwards from there to say when will we override that and allow foreign workers to come. So yet again, and when it comes to the tech scene, the Canadian government has recognized that there's a demand and that we actually benefit from this. So they've opened up various avenues to allow foreign workers to come to Canada. And certainly foreign employers are also recognizing this and therefore setting up branches in Canada or launching in Canada to begin with. And they have that access to the foreign market that, frankly, I mean, our biggest competitor is always the U.S. And the U.S. has been restricted the last couple of years. And there's opportunity. So we take advantage of that, and we can bring the workers. And a lot of U.S. companies, even if they can't get their workers directly to the U.S., they still rather have them here in the Western Hemisphere for time zones, ability to coordinate and cooperate. So bottom line is, yes, there is opportunity in the tech field, both from the point of view of the employer and the employee.
And it seems like you've seen an increase in some multinational corporations from the U.S. moving to Canada.
Definitely, as I say, there is this opportunity, and corporations are recognizing it and taking advantage of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the biggest sort of similarity to or one of the biggest visas a lot of people go to in the U.S. is the H-1B visa in the tech scene. So I was just wondering, there is some restrictions with the H-1B visa. For example, I believe that a foreign national has to be paid as much as a U.S. worker in order to get an H-1B visa. So does the Canadian visas have something similar, or is it a lot?
No, there are still. I don't want to give the impression that it's a walk in the park. Despite the fact that the government recognizes the demand in this field, there are still plenty of requirements that need to be met, both in terms of the employer and the employee, and maybe we can get into the heart of that. But certainly, I mean, one factor is wages. We don't want when I say we, I'm speaking on behalf of the Canadian government. But the philosophy is we don't want foreign workers coming in and undercutting Canadian workers. I mean, yes, then we can have a flood of workers, but the Canadian employers have to pay these people appropriate wages, and there is a way to calculate what that will be in any particular case.
Okay, cool. That's great to know. So I think you sort of briefly mentioned it, but we should just get on to it. So what are some stuff that, what are some tips and things that you think employers and employees should know?
So getting into the heart of things, I will say that, first of all, we need to recognize that There are some exceptions, but the basic rule is when we're looking at work permits, we need to start with the employer. It is the employer that drives the process. I recognize that from the point of view of many of your listeners, perhaps they are a potential employee. That's okay, but they still need to understand that what the employer needs to do, because without understanding that, they can't solve their own problem anyway. So we need to look at both ends of that coin. So let's break it down into employer and employee, and then go from there. Before getting into that, I just, I think today is looking more at sort of the forest rather than the trees, the basic philosophies and procedures and processes and what goes on. But I think there are a couple of trees that people need to understand within the system, without which you can't understand the forest. So one of those trees is something called the NOC, the National Occupational Classification. I just want to mention this before getting into the heart of things, because again, you need to understand this, or you can't really utilize the system properly. So the National Occupational Classification is basically, in fact, in the U.S. it's called this, but it's a dictionary of occupations, and any occupation that's out there should be covered through this classification system. Now, it is possible that you have a job title that doesn't exactly match what's in the NOC, but you have to somehow equate what's available to what your job is. So you look at these NOCs, they are 4-digit codes, and there's a whole science as to understanding the codes. But the bottom line is they're sort of broken down by both there's a grid, and it's broken down by industry or sector, rather. Like there are business sectors, health sectors, and science sectors, which many of the people here will fall into. And then we look at the levels within that, which are either management level or then sort of going down by education. Those require university degrees, college diplomas, etc. And you have to know where you fit into this NOC, because without knowing that, you don't know if you're going to qualify for any particular program. And it is this NOC, for instance, you asked a moment ago about salaries. Well, you don't know the salary of a job unless you know what the NOC code is. Because when you have the NOC code, you can then determine what it is and go from there. So I just wanted to mention this NOC before dealing with other things. And also, we're using the word work loosely, but under legal definitions, there are some implications to this term. And I always say that I live in the immigration world, which is not always the same as the real world. And sometimes we have to take terms used in the real world and sort of fit that square peg into our round hole. So whatever terms are used out there, relocation, secondment, sometimes business visit if it's short term, whatever terms are out there, in a sense, doesn't matter. We have to fit that into what the Canadian law allows for. So basically, we're either dealing with work on a temporary basis in this case, or not. And the real issue is whether you're doing something productive here. So I know a lot of people say, I'm just here on a business visit, it's only a week. But that's very nice. But just because it's a week doesn't mean you're not working. So I just wanted to digress with these 2 points, the NOC and the definition of work, because again, going through everything else, it will be important. So that being said, again, we were going to go into some of the structure of the system and how it works. So yet again, we're starting with the employer. So from the point of view that I mentioned, that we are protecting the Canadian workers, the government says, we're not going to let you bring in a foreign worker unless you can justify to us that there's a reason to hire a foreign worker. Why couldn't you hire a Canadian? And to do that, the employer has to get what's called an LMIA, Labor Market Impact Assessment. This in itself is a long, complex story. We could spend plenty of time just on this, but the basic idea is you have to show that you've advertised, you've tried to find a Canadian, you couldn't find one, you are paying the appropriate wage or offering the appropriate wage, and whatever other conditions you might have to meet. And there are stringent requirements about where to advertise, how long to advertise. So you do have to take that into account. That is the basic building block or the foundation of the work permit system, that we don't want foreign workers unless you can show us that there's a reason to override hiring a Canadian. But this is where it gets interesting, because now we look for all kinds of exceptions, exemptions, and other strategies that might allow us to overcome this. So firstly, and I mean, I'm going just in order sort of the strictness to easiness of getting these various authorizations to work. But The next level is really something that impacts the high-tech industry directly, and that is something called the global talent stream. And if you Google that, you will find all kinds of information,
Mm.
and we get all kinds of inquiries. Oh, look at this! I'm a software engineer. I must qualify. Well, hold on. Again, we got to slow it down a little bit. So the global talent stream is a subset of
Right.
an LMIA. So it is an LMIA. It's just that the government says that we recognize that there are shortages in certain high tech fields, and there is a listing of specific
Right.
occupations that qualify. There are 12, and I'm not going to go through them all, but
Mm-hmm.
things like computer managers, computer engineers, information systems analysts. So if you fit into one of those, it is possible that you will qualify for the GTS, Global Talent Stream version of an LMIA. But let's just take a look at that.
Right.
So first of all, what that means is that again, this is a streamlined version of an LMIA, and the employer will be able to bypass recruitment. So this is certainly a huge benefit. You do not have to show that we can't find a Canadian, and that's usually the hardest part. And also there is expedited processing
Right.
supposedly for these kinds of cases. It's a little slower during COVID, I would say, but still it's out there. But
Mm-hmm.
employers should also recognize that it is not automatic. And this is something we see all the time, that employers say, look at this, I'm going to get myself a GTS version of the LMIA and life is good. Yes, it is. And we do utilize the program. But there
Right.
are things at the back end that will come back to haunt you if you don't do it right. And that is, the government says the trade off for not recruiting
So,
is that you have to show us certain benefits that you're going to give to Canada. You're going to increase revenue, perhaps. You're going to increase skills and training. Going to increase diversity. And you have to provide a
mm-hmm.
labor market benefits plan about which you'll be audited. Probably about, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So
Sure,
I have a quick question about that. So who determines like
right.
for the jobs that go into the global talent stream, is it like a Canadian audit, a Canadian government audit that goes into some of the requirements that they have, or how is it
Well,
determined
there's
what jobs go into the global talent stream?
every topic could branch off into 25 other topics, but there are various departments within the government that make determinations, and in this one, is probably made through a department called ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada, which for our purposes is really the labor department, and they determine what jobs are in demand,
Mm.
and where in the country and things like this. That's what they do all day, every day. By the way, this is not just in relation to foreign workers. Like
Okay.
for Canadians too, if you want to know like what field of study should you go into in university, you might want to look at some of publications from ESDC. They'll tell you this kind of information too. So I mean, it applies all around. So they determine these job categories. Presumably, they know what's in demand.
Okay.
There is also the Canadian Government Job Bank, one of the sources you need to advertise in the general LMIA program, that through which they get statistics to know what's in demand or not. I would stress again, though, by the way, that the title is not the key. It is the substance of the job based on the knock. So this is one example of where that knock comes in. So if you call yourself an information systems analyst, that's very nice, but you have to look at the knock definitions to know if you qualify. All right. So anyway, the government determines that.
Right. Okay.
But I was
Makes
saying
sense.
that there is the front end benefit of no recruitment,
Mhm.
but there is the back end that the employers do need to be aware of, and they should not take that for granted, because if they can't meet those audit requirements a few months down the road, they're going to have other problems. Um, so just to be aware.
Right.
Um, so
Mm.
just sort of looking at where we are. So we said we only let in foreign workers with an LMIA, but there's a special LMIA called the Global Talent Stream, and that's a way to expedite getting people in the high tech fields. And again, it's good, but don't. There are issues that you need to worry about. There are other. Then the government says, sometimes we're going to let employers hire foreign workers even without a an LMIA or a global talent stream version of that. And often we spend a lot of our time looking for one of these
Okay.
exemptions from the LMIAs. So the different exemptions can arise all the time. They do tweak these things, but for now, the sort of primary ones are intra-company transfer. That is, if there's a company that has a branch in Canada and a foreign branch, and it doesn't necessarily matter which is the parent and which is the subsidiary,
Right.
and within that there is a foreign worker that has specialized knowledge or managerial capacity, that person can get a work permit in Canada without
Mm-hmm.
a labor market impact assessment. So uh, for some people that don't work for a foreign branch of a Canadian company, that obviously doesn't apply. But if there are situations where certainly that does apply if you happen to work abroad for a company that has a Canadian office, and B, in terms
Yeah.
of longer term strategy, it does require 1 year of work with the foreign company. So sometimes if the company hires this person overseas for a year, then they might qualify for an intercompany transfer.
Right.
Like everything else I talk about today, though,
Mm-hmm.
it's never automatic. There are always issues. So, for instance, we talk about specialized knowledge. Well, what does that mean? An officer will have to determine that, and one of the key components is proprietary knowledge. So, you could be the most brilliant programmer in the world, but if you don't have some proprietary knowledge of that company's product, you won't qualify for intercompany transfer. So, this is one exemption.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another exemption, Canada
Mm-hmm.
has a whole bunch of free trade agreements. I mean, the most famous is certainly now CUSMA, which is the Canada, United States, Mexico agreement, formerly known as NAFTA. But they have changed it.
Mm.
Honestly, for immigration purposes, it's pretty much what it was before the change. People just have to get used to the term CUSMA. But that does allow all these
Okay.
agreements have that I'm about to mention have provisions for certain professionals to come work in Canada without an LMIA. So under CUSMA, there are, for instance,
Mm.
computer systems analysts, management consultants. There are about 60 jobs actually, some of which will overlap with high tech, including engineers. So if you are an American citizen or Mexican citizen,
Right.
this is something that can be utilized. But there are other agreements. For instance, there are similar agreements with some Latin American countries, with Chile, Peru, and Colombia, for instance. Some of them have what we call positive lists, like I just said, there are jobs, and some that are listed, and some are negative in that
Mm-hmm.
as long as your job isn't on the list, you're okay to come. So you have to just check those lists. But
Okay.
then there are sort of the newer versions of agreements. For instance, there's the CPTPP, which is a lot of letters, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which covers a lot of Pacific Rim countries, including, for instance, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, Singapore. So if you're from one of those countries, it is possible that you qualify as a professional as well, so the company won't need an LMIA. But there, it's not so much a pigeonhole approach of,
Mm.
you're in particular occupation X or Y. It is more that you have a certain level of education and you're a professional. You're coming as an independent contractor, things like this. So you can possibly qualify. But usually those will be capped at 1 year. Sometimes they're extendable, but it gets a little harder. And then we have the
Mm-hmm.
European Union version of that, which is called CETA, CETA, which is the same idea, but obviously for citizens of the European Union, of which, just to note that the UK is no longer a member, so UK citizens don't qualify, but Canada is
Okay.
implementing new provisions directly with the UK, which are
Mm.
going to mimic that more or less. So again, just a brief summary that
Right.
Canada has various free trade agreements, some of which will allow people to come to Canada to work, and employers and employees can take advantage of that. Another program
Mm.
to avoid an LMIA. This one sometimes seems too good to be true, but I don't know how many people on your podcast will qualify for this. But if you speak French and you're working outside Quebec in a NOC 0,
Okay.
A, or B, so yet again we look at the NOC. NOC 0 means management, A is university, B is college level. If you're working in those fields outside Quebec and you speak French to a relative degree of fluency, you can bypass an LMIA. Now, whatever the government philosophy in that
Right.
regard is, which is to increase diversity across the country in terms of language, etc., that's fine. But for our purposes, we can certainly take advantage of that. And there are other LMIA
Right.
exemptions that exist that sometimes have value. Just to mention one more, there's something called reciprocal benefit, which means that if, let's say, there's a company with multiple offices around the world, and they have a bunch of Canadians working elsewhere, they can then bring a foreign worker into Canada in a kind of tit for tat scenario, because I mentioned earlier that we're trying to protect Canadian
Okay.
workers, but the government says, well, if we're giving Canadian workers opportunities abroad, we should then reciprocate and allow foreign workers to come here, and it kind of evens out. So, so
Right.
if you have any
Okay.
questions at this point, but basically so just to summarize, so far we've looked at the employer scenario, which is you really are supposed to hire a
Yeah.
Canadian first. If you want to hire a foreign worker, you need to prove to the government that you can't find a Canadian. That's the LMIA process. Within that, there's a special version called the Global Talent Stream for high-tech workers. And sometimes you can show that we don't need an
Mhm.
LMIA at all because we fit into one of these various categories. That's the employer. So
And it seems like a lot of them, like, it seems like for the employer, they're the first thing they should try for is to get rid of the LMIA requirement. It seems
yeah,
like that's like the first approach,
yes,
and
because an
then maybe
LMIA
fall back onto
has,
it.
you know, difficulties, frankly, associated with it. You have to show that there's no Canadian around, which is a long process, expensive, and what if you don't find that? Which is, and maybe not, we've had situations where a company says, "Look, we want to hire this foreign worker. We think he's the right person for the job," and we tell them, "Well, we need to advertise," and suddenly they find a Canadian, and they say, "Oh, okay, we're going to hire the Canadian." That's actually what the government wants.
Okay.
If that works out, that's great.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
We
pretty
sort of,
funny.
in the immigration world, yet again, we have our own world. We look at this from the point of view like that there already is probably a foreign worker that is suitable for this job. But from the government's point of view, they're looking at it as a sort of a last resort. We don't want to hire the foreign worker, so we go through this process, um, and show that we couldn't find a
Hmm.
Canadian. So if that finds us a Canadian, that's great. Anyway, so that's the
Yeah,
employer
makes
side, and
sense.
then the employee side. Then we sort of shift over to the employee. The employer has done what they need to do, and now what does the employee need to do? Well, the first thing is I would suggest is the employee needs to understand what the employer has to do, because without understanding that, they don't know how they fit into this whole picture. And we often get inquiries from people. I'd like to work in Canada. That's fine. I understand the point, but it's not kind of an abstract thing. We have to look at it from the employer first, because without an employer, you're not going to get a work permit. You need a quote unquote sponsor. There are a few exceptions, but overall, that is the
Yeah.
process. So once we sort of figured out what the employer is doing,
Hmm.
the employee certainly has to meet the credentials required for that job. So, let's say you do want to hire a computer programmer, and it says, and the requirements, I'm just, giving general requirements. They may not actually be exactly what's in the knock, but it might say, a degree in computer science or computer engineering. Well, if you, the foreign worker, don't have that, you're not getting a work permit, even if your employer got an LMIA.
Right. Okay.
So be aware of that. And there may be language issues as well sometimes.
Yeah.
You have to do that. And you have to recognize, there is processing time and depends where you are in the world. With COVID, there's an extra layer that everybody needs to go through if they're not in the US, which is to apply online. For some people, that was already true anyway, right? It depends if you need yet again, there's so many topics, but those
Hmm.
that need a visa always needed to apply through a processing center, um, generally online these days. Those that didn't need a visa could just apply by showing up at the airport or at the port of entry. But now everybody has to go online during the
Yeah.
COVID process, unless you're coming from the United States and you don't need a visa. So that being said, anyway,
Hmm.
I would suggest to people, I know that depending where in the world, there are all kinds of agencies out there that promise you jobs and say that we're going to find you a job and do all the legal work. You have to be really careful about those. I would suggest that some of these companies out there uh, are
Hmm.
not do not understand this system. They are, I don't know what they're using to be the employer, and you really have to be careful. But an organization that sort of is just generically finding you jobs and acting on your behalf to get you a work permit, because usually it's two separate things. And there are actually issues in
Right.
some provinces about paying recruitment fees. If an agency out there wants you to pay it for finding you a job, that could be a problem. These are kind of red flags to look for. And
Right.
also, I'm going to mention that I know the reality is that a lot of employees that come ultimately want to get permanent residence. That's fine as well, but there are some things to consider there that people should be wary of as well. Number one is, it is not automatic. Just because you got a work permit does not mean you qualify for permanent residence. And you might want to consider that today, not
Right.
figure it out 2 years from now. Yeah, exactly. You're here already.
When you come here.
So, when you apply for permanent residence,
Right.
firstly, certainly work experience in Canada is an important factor in getting permanent residence. So sometimes that will ultimately allow people to qualify. But there are language issues. There are educational equivalency issues. With all due respect to various educational institutions out there, everybody has to have their education evaluated. And sometimes we discover that what you think is a bachelor's degree is not given that equivalency to a Canadian degree. So you do have to be careful. And if that is the case, the permanent residence is going to be based on points. You're going to find you're losing points all over the place, and suddenly you don't qualify. So if your ultimate goal is permanent residence, even if you don't qualify today, but take a look at your situation today to see, will you qualify a couple of years down the road, because otherwise, you might have an issue. So just something to think about. Okay. So, I mean, those are sort of the primary things. I also perhaps would just mention students. I'm sure some of the people you have out there want to come study in Canada. That is, although it can lead to a work permit and lead to permanent residence, but you have to each program is separate. First, you have to qualify as a student. So in that regard, certainly you need an acceptance to a Canadian institution. You need to have the funds to show that you can cover the cost of the tuition plus room and board and, just life in general. And actually, this is true with any temporary type permit or visa. You need to show temporary intent, which is sometimes the hardest part, which means that, will you leave Canada if you need to? And everybody, of course, says, of course. But sometimes an officer is not persuaded. And sometimes they want to look at things like, what's your situation back home? Do you have family there? Does their family business? Things like this that show that there's some tie, that you won't just abandon all that and stay in Canada. That being said, even if your ultimate goal is permanent residence, you have to, there's sort of this dichotomy that on one hand, you need to show temporary residence today, even if you have or temporary intent, even if you have permanent intent for the future. But anyway, you get yourself an acceptance and show you have the money, and presumably show that you're a credible person that would leave if they need to. And you can study in Canada, and that could lead to an open work permit after your studies, what's called a postgraduate work permit. So this is one of the exceptions where you don't have to have an employer, quote unquote, sponsor you. And then depending on the length of your study, you can work for up to 3 years. And then you might qualify for permanent residence too. So it's sort of a gradual way to approach that. Yeah.
So with that, is there any, does the employer have any negatives of hiring somebody on an open work permit?
No, actually, from the employer's point of view, it's easier. When it's an open work permit, you can just hire them. But again, when it comes to permanent residence, you're going to need to show that the employer will continue to hire you, to employ you. So there are some requirements there. But I mean, if I'm an employer and someone comes to me today with an open work permit, I am good to go. I have no requirements of any or restrictions of any kind to hire that person. As usual, there are always exceptions, because I know it's not today's topic, but for medical fields, you need a medical exam and things like this. But anyway, in the high-tech field, there should be no reason not to hire this person.
So it seems like for students who are, or for, high school students or parents who might be listening, thinking about sending their children, it seems like the best path if they want to move to Canada ultimately would be the student route if they have a choice right now.
It depends where you are in your in your life, right? If this is the right age for you, or if you're the parent of someone of this age, yes, this is a route. But for those that might be older, have completed their education, etc., obviously we're looking at some of the other work permit routes we've covered today.
Right. And I assume a master's would be the same as the undergrad in
Yes.
terms of like
You only get it
open
once though.
work
So if
permit
you do
stuff.
your bachelor's degree and get an open work permit, and then you do your master's, you do not get another open work permit after that. You get one shot. Um,
Okay.
and I just
Okay.
would briefly
That makes
mention there are a
sense.
couple of not immigration issues per se, but there's some obvious overlap. There are relocation costs when people are coming to Canada to work. You have to look at who's going to pay for some of these things. You also have to look at the reality that, like any job, it might end. Maybe your employer doesn't like you. Maybe you don't like your employer. Both these things can happen. And what happens to
Right.
you? Well, talking you meaning the foreign worker at this point, you're in Canada, and for whatever reason your job terminates. You will not be able to work anywhere else, generally speaking, unless you get a new sponsor and maybe go through the whole process all over again, depending on what category you came through. So things like this to consider. And from the employer's point of view as well, sometimes there can be liability that somebody uprooted themselves and uh, they came all the way across the planet, and now there might be some liability there. But again, that's not an immigration issue per se, but things that
Right.
employers might need to look out for. And on top of all that, of course, we're in the middle of the COVID situation.
Mhm.
Uh, that obviously adds a layer, but I don't want to. People kind of look at this as like all lumped together. I think it's important to distinguish these things. Yes, we have to worry about the COVID issues, which might dictate how to apply, um, who can come to Canada in certain situations. Usually, work is allowed. Depends on a few variables. And when you get here, you
Mhm.
might have to quarantine, things like this. But it doesn't change the overall structure of the system, which we've just gone through. So again, these are some of the topics I thought might be of interest to your
Mhm.
listeners today. If you have any other aspects you'd like to cover, I'd be
Yeah.
happy to
No.
do it.
I think no. I think you've covered a lot of stuff. I think this is a really good overview for people, and of course, if they want to get into the details, they can research stuff online. Perhaps even contact you. However, however they can go forward with it. So I think from the Canadian tech scene, I think we sort of come full circle with it. I have more of a personal question, I guess. I like I more question related to me, and I know I'm not sure how like well versed you'd be in like U.S. immigration law in this case, but you did mention NAFTA, so I was just wondering for Canadian citizens. I know, especially a lot of people from the University of Waterloo, they want to move to the U.S. For a job after the graduation, and so I was just wondering from that perspective, from the TN perspective, did you have any advice or any thoughts on that? Like, how is that process easy? Is it hard? What do Canadians have to do for that?
Right. Well, my first comment on that point would be that people should be very careful about assuming that US and Canadian requirements are the same, even under the same agreement. We have on the Canadian side various bulletins and interpretations and things that come out from the immigration department all the time about how these things are to be looked at, including, for instance, I mentioned this proprietary knowledge for intra-company transfer and wage requirements. These things are interpreted in certain ways. And just because it's a certain way in Canada, do not assume that it's the same in the US, which is part of the reason I do not myself practice directly in
Mhm.
US immigration law, even though I have a general idea of the issues there. But it's important to work with someone that doesn't dabble because it's not the same. They are completely different. And I have US colleagues that I refer to, and they refer to me because we're on the
Right.
same wavelength. But anyway, that being said, just to be clear that CUSMA, formerly NAFTA, but we have to get used to this new term, it only applies to citizens of Canada, the US, and Mexico. So if you're talking about a Canadian citizen moving to the US under CUSMA, that may be quite possible. But again, you have to look at the job categories such as computer systems analyst, etc. Computer programmer is not on the list, just to be clear. Engineer is on the list. So, a lot of people are going to be
Okay.
under the title software engineer or something like that. So it's possible. So for Canadian citizens, yes, there are opportunities there. For foreign students who want to go work in the U.S., CUSMA does not apply, but there may be other programs that they can look at under U.S. law, including H-1Bs in some situations. But again, that's a separate question of U.S. law.
Right. Okay. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thanks for touching on that. And yeah, I guess like from what I was thinking, I think we've covered most of the stuff. And I think thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It was super informative. I learned a lot about immigration law, and I'm sure people listening to the podcast have also learned a lot. And yeah, guys, if you if you have any more questions, feel free to check it online. Reach out to Benjamin. Reach out to me. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.